Italy has a reputation for performing very poorly during World War II. From their failure against the British in Egypt, to their defeat at the hands of the Greeks, to the loss of Sicily, Italy generally performed very poorly. Still, early on in the war, Italy did see some success against the British in East Africa, namely during the Italian invasion of British Somaliland, when they conquered an area of roughly 140,000 square kilometers. A few years prior to World War II, in 1935 and 1936, Italy embarked on a colonial campaign to conquer Abyssinia from their colonies along the coast, and they were successful in uniting Eritrea, Somalia, and Abyssinia into one colony, Italian East Africa. A few years passed as Italy tried to improve its sluggish economy and subpar army. The outbreak of World War II in September 1939 offered Italy an opportunity to seize land from Britain and France. On June 10, 1940, Mussolini rashly brought Italy into World War II by capitalizing on France's weakened state after Germany invaded the north of the country. Due to France's impending surrender, Mussolini feared missing out on obtaining French lands in the Alps and North Africa. In addition, Mussolini wanted to prove his worth to Hitler's Germany, and he feared that he would be sidelined in Europe by Germany if he did not attack France and Britain. Mussolini had his own plans for a modern Italian empire across the Mediterranean, too. Once France was defeated, Mussolini considered, Britain would surely surrender as well. He expected the war to be over quickly, therefore, he did not believe it necessary to ensure his army was ready. However, Britain fought on even after France's surrender, leaving an unprepared Italian economy and military at war with the world's largest empire. The Italian army's first engagement with the British would be in East Africa, namely, an invasion of British Somaliland. The capture of British Somaliland was a pressing concern for Italian political and military leaders. Before France surrendered on the 25th, both Djibouti and Berbera were available ports for the Allies, and this harbor infrastructure could allow Britain to station more troops in Somaliland. In addition, Italians in East Africa were fighting a two-front war and needed to occupy Somaliland to protect their flanks. The armistice signed by France on June 25th ended hostilities between France and the Axis and set up a new French government. Italy wanted to occupy the colony so it could move its forces from Djibouti into British Somaliland, but Djibouti, under Vichy French rule, tried to resist Italian authority. The Italians were unable to seize French weapons in the colony due to its resistance, but were able to seize the port to prevent it from falling into British hands. The British plan for the defense of Somaliland was contentious during the interwar period in the first few months of the war. Initially, in 1936, after the Italian occupation of Ethiopia, the War Office preferred a complete abandonment of Somaliland in the event of war. They concluded that it was better to put resources elsewhere instead of being overrun by the Italians. On the other hand, the colonial governor, Arthur Lawrence, opposed this defeatist disposition and instead argued that the colony should be defended. Indeed, Brigadier Arthur Chater, who would later lead the British forces in Somaliland, supported the defense of the colony and claimed he could hold out for 12 days before reinforcements could arrive. When World War II began in 1939, the British government finally decided to defend Berbera for as long as possible to avoid losing imperial prestige. By August 1940, the British troops were uncoordinated and undersupplied. Contrary to Italian intelligence, who believed they had over 80 artillery, anti-aircraft, and anti-tank guns, the British in fact only had less than 40 large-caliber weapons. Italy overestimated the number of British troops opposing them to be 11,000, but in reality they had only 4,500, 75% of which were less experienced colonial troops. The British correctly guessed that Berbera would be Italy's primary objective. Although they were outnumbered more than 5 to 1 when the invasion started, they were defending on favorable mountainous terrain. Still, with the resources available, Brigadier Chater was aware of how difficult it would be to defend the colony. Poor infrastructure prohibited the maintenance of a large military garrison. In addition, it was impossible for him to defend across the entire border, so he had to position his defenses at strategic locations in the mountains and seize the high ground. The most likely invasion route was from southwest Somaliland, in which the Italians would have to advance through the mountain passes. Brigadier Chatter garrisoned a location called Tug Argan, a gap in the mountains that Italian troops would likely enter. It was the only pass with a decent road for vehicles. In 1939, the British constructed pillboxes at Tug Argan and Sheik Pass as a defensive measure. The British plan was to have Somali police and elements of the Camel Corps to scout and harass Italian units to delay their advance. Yemeni, Rhodesian, and King's African Rifle troops would guard the mountain passes and defend Berbera. In June 1940, the Viceroy of Italian East Africa, Prince Amadeo of Aosta, was largely unprepared for war, yet he had a sizable force on paper. In total, the Italians had 290,000 troops in East Africa, 200,000 of which were indigenous colonial troops. On the Somaliland frontier, Italy had roughly 4,500 Italian troops and 20,000 colonial troops, under the command of General Nassi. He had 187 combat aircraft with another 130 in various states of maintenance, but most of these planes were obsolete. The Italians had 136 bombers, with over half of them being slow, under-armed Caproni CA-133s. The most modern bomber available was the SM-79, of which they only had 12. Italy's most available fighter was the CR-42, a modern biplane with excellent speed, firepower, and agility, but they were in too few numbers to be used effectively. Most Italian fighters in the region were obsolete CR-32s. Another thing plaguing the Italian Air Force was a lack of munitions, most of which had been consumed during the war against Ethiopia a few years prior. In addition, many Italian planes lacked modern radio equipment, or even radio equipment at all, leading to terrible coordination. The British aviation situation wasn't much better. Altogether, they had about 100 operational combat aircraft. They had numerous Vickers-Wellesleys. These were too old to fight in Europe, so they were deployed in East Africa against other old aircraft that the Italians were using. They also had modern Gloucester Gladiator biplanes and Bristol Blenheim light bombers. Italian East Africa also had the Red Sea Flotilla at its disposal. This naval force had 7 destroyers, 8 submarines, 14 torpedo boats, and armed merchant cruisers, and a hospital ship. The presence of this force in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden threatened to intercept supplies headed for British Somaliland. With the Italian entrance into the war in June, minor battles occurred on the border with Sudan for the next few weeks, with the Italians occupying a number of border towns with the goal of tying down British troops and gaining buffer space between Britain and the colony. The real attack, which the British were suspecting, would be directed towards British Somaliland. At first, Amadeo ordered small raids into British Somaliland to harass the enemy. On June 24th, Italian forces advanced and occupied the city of Borama, 4 miles across the border into Somaliland. The Italians planned to use this city as a gathering point for a future offensive, and until then, it would be used as a buffer space protecting the rest of Italian East Africa. In response, a group of British cavalry and colonial troops scouted and raided the Italians at Borama on June 29th. This aggressive British response convinced General Nassi of the necessity to push the British out of Somaliland. On August 3rd, General Nassi launched his offensive along 2 axes. The largest force advanced along the Borama-Hargeisa road. This force consisted of 11 infantry battalions, 14 artillery batteries, 21 howitzer batteries, 12 L3/35 light tanks, 6 M11/39 medium tanks, and 12 armored cars. A second, smaller force planned to march north to Zela, from which it could then swing east to capture Berbera. This force had 10 total infantry battalions and 5 artillery batteries. The force included 2 blackshirt battalions, of which one was an elite battalion of the Savoy Grenadiers. This force also had the task of preventing the British from escaping into Vichy French Djibouti. Finally, the third force, consisting of one infantry battalion, irregular troops, and one artillery battery, planned to advance through Sheikh Pass and onto Berbera. If all three groups were successful, the British path of retreat would be cut off and Berbera would face attacks from three directions. Before and during the battle, the British and Italians launched aerial attacks, with the Italians attacking shipping off of Berbera and the British destroying an Italian airbase. The Italian troops began their advance on August 3rd. The British Camel Corps blocked the advance to Bergesa and delayed the Italians for 2 days. On August 4th, 3 SM-79s bombed Berbera for light damage. With the capture of Bergesa on the 5th, the Italians halted their advance to reorganize, especially after Blenheims bombed their supply column. The British also destroyed 3 L3/35 tankettes with anti-tank rifles. The Italians brought up more planes to the airbase at Hargeisa, as they needed to achieve aerial supremacy to continue their swift advance. Throughout this day, SM-79s bombed Zela, Berbera, and Aden. The Italians saw the greatest success in the north, as they were able to quickly capture Zela and cut off the British from French Somaliland by August 10th. The easternmost force captured Uwayan on the 6th. Due to the Italian threat, Britain planned to reinforce Somaliland with troops, artillery, and anti-aircraft guns from elements of the 4th and 5th Indian Infantry Divisions in Egypt. However, plans for reinforcements were scrapped when it became obvious that Berbera would not be able to hold out for enough time. The only reinforcements received were 2 30mm anti-aircraft guns from Hong Kong. On August 8th, 9th, and 10th, the Italians approached Tug Argan. The hilly terrain provided the British with a great opportunity to delay the Italian advance. But, with only a few machine gun posts and very little artillery, the British did not have enough firepower to stop the overwhelming Italian numbers. M11/39 medium tanks were instrumental in the Italian advance, and the British lacked anti-tank weapons capable of reliably eliminating them. In response, the Australian cruiser HMAS Hobart dismantled the 47mm naval gun and shipped it to the British defenders at Tug Argan. The gun was positioned on the high ground, giving it an excellent perspective. This naval gun was capable of piercing the 30mm armor on the Italian medium tanks, but due to the contraption that it was loaded on, it took 5 minutes to reload a single shot. By August 10th, both sides were gearing up for a fight at Tug Argan. The British defenses covered a series of hills and passes, strengthened by machine gun nests. They also had 4 37mm anti-tank guns, which they divided among 2 hills. The Italians, with their 3-pronged invasion of British Somaliland, had used their numerical advantage to force the British to defend across a wide front. At Tug Argan, many gaps formed in the British defenses. Not all mountain passes could be covered, and the hills could not provide supporting fire for one another. The Italians were able to flank British positions or concentrate all of their fire at one position. The Italians began their advance on the 11th with medium tanks, tankettes, and motorized infantry. Observation Hill was the first hill they needed to capture. The rugged, uneven terrain made it difficult for the tanks to advance, and, making matters worse for the Italians, they only had inaccurate maps that were over 15 years old. Despite the terrain being in Britain's favor, they could not compete with the overwhelming Italian firepower. The Italians used a combination of artillery, bombers, and fighters to bombard Observation Hill and Mill Hill. Initially, the British positions seemed to hold, and the 47mm naval gun on Observation Hill and 2 37mm guns on Mill Hill repelled the armored attack, but the Italians used their numerical advantage to advance around the flank of these hills through the Mirgo Pass. The Rhodesians put up a tough resistance on Castle Hill, which defended the flank of Mill and Observation Hills. The Italians pressed on, taking heavy casualties, but they were able to overrun Mill Hill, capturing 2 37mm guns. With the loss of 2 artillery pieces and their troops on the hills cut off by Italian attacks, the British were in a critical position. On August 14th, the British attempted to resupply the surrounded defenders on Castle, Observation, Nobby, and Black Hill, but their supply trucks were ambushed by the Italians. The failure of this relief mission resulted in heavy casualties for the British due to lack of water, as the hot Somali summer sapped the strength of the defenders. Still, they were able to defend for the rest of the day. General Godwin Austen, who replaced Chatters, became convinced of his defeat due to the intense bombardment of the eastern hills and the failure of his relief mission. He ordered a retreat to Berbera. Consequently, by the end of the 15th, the eastern hills were in Italian hands, as well as most of the heavy British weaponry which had to be abandoned. At first, General Carlo de Simone believed that the British were conducting a feint retreat, but after realizing their true intentions, he ordered a massive attack on the 17th towards Lafarugue. The capture of this town would open the road to Berbera and give the Italians another airbase. Despite having superior numbers, de Simone's indigenous troops were exhausted from the combat, and coordination between units was poor, leading to a failed assault. The Black Watch, consisting of British soldiers, had managed to push the Italians back with the bayonet charge while holding the path of retreat open. The large caliber weapons that the British had left destroyed a few enemy tanks. Still, running low on ammunition and unable to defend a long front line, the British were forced to retreat to Berbera. The British evacuated the troops and equipment that they could from Berbera by August 19th. They blew up bridges in Somaliland to slow the Italian advance, but they inadvertently destroyed the bridges too early while the Black Watch was still holding off the Italians. Consequently, the Black Watch was able to evacuate Berbera, but left their heavy equipment behind. The British evacuation was successful. In total, 5,690 troops and 1,266 civilians were evacuated by the HMAS Hobart and Royal Navy ships. This success was guaranteed by the fact that the Italians did not launch an attack as the British were retreating, due to the poor terrain and weather. The Italians captured some anti-tank guns, 5 mortars, 5 artillery, 3 Bren gun carriers, large quantities of small arms and ammunition, and over 100 trucks. The trucks would be especially important in facilitating the supply of Italian troops in later battles. Casualty estimates for the invasion are unclear, but the defenders suffered around 250 British casualties and around 2,000 Somali casualties. The Italians endured around 161 Italian casualties and up to 3,000 colonial and irregular casualties. During the battle, both sides proved that they had adequate discipline and combat effectiveness. The successful Italian occupation eliminated the possibility of a two-front war in East Africa for a short time. Italy could direct its focus on fighting against British troops in Sudan and Kenya, although they had little success. The Italian victory was short-lived, as 7 months later, the British would invade Somaliland from the south, and with an amphibious assault on Berbera, known as Operation Appearance. The invasion, and the whole of the East African campaign, had an effect on the fighting in North Africa, as British forces were diverted to Sudan, allowing Rommel to make an advance in 1941. The invasion was also a political setback for Britain. Winston Churchill was furious at the damage done to the empire's prestige, and he condemned Archibald Wavell, the overall commander for the Middle East, for the defeat. In hindsight, the invasion was entirely stoppable, but the British had neglected the defense of the colony during the years prior, and their unpreparedness ultimately led to their defeat.